let me just talk about a historical event that I always love to reimagine in my mind, and it takes place right here in Washington, D.C. In 1896. I'm going to read it, though, so I'll be succinct. The year was 1896, the place, and the 19th Street Baptist Church, which on a sweltering day in July was filled with African-American women activists who had come to create the first national black women's organization in the country's history, the National Association of Colored Women, NACW. Quote, "It was a famous gathering of famous women," noted one of the attendees, Rosetta Douglas Sprague, an activist and daughter of the abolitionist and statesman Frederick Douglass. Already famous was the NACW's first elected president, Washington, D.C. resident Mary Church Terrell, whose life epitomized change. 17 years after her election, she was asked by the newly formed sorority at Howard University, Delta Sigma Theta, to lead them in the Great Women's Suffrage Parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1913, at a time when the mainstream white women's organizations were determined to exclude black women. The sorority was the second such organization that was founded. The first was Alpha Kappa Alpha, established in 1908. I know I have to do both. Established in 1908, and both entities, as well as other organizations and sororities after them, took the NACW as their model, particularly its values around education. In fact, at a time when Booker T. Washington's industrial education in the trades had gained ascendancy, it was the desire and determination of black students to be scholars in the liberal arts tradition that was the motive for the founding of the black Greek letter organizations, including those of the guys. 40 years later, after that parade, Terrell could be seen on picket lines with her cane and hearing aid. She was 90 years old at the time, in 1953, and a leader of a group of activists determined to desegregate Washington, D.C., and over the course of 3 years had marshaled national and indeed international support for the monumental 53 Thompson Supreme Court case that upheld previous anti-discrimination laws in the city and effectively desegregated Washington. During the course of that historic 1896 meeting, the women also paid tribute to those who had come before them: Phyllis Wheatley, Margaret Garner, Sojourner Truth. But they were fortunate to have among them the great abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who was there at this meeting in 1896 and then in her 70s. Tubman had escaped from slavery in 1849 and led hundreds of others to do so, most spectacularly as the only woman to lead a military campaign. In the spring of 1863, when Union troops were poised to sail their gunboats from Beaufort, South Carolina, up the Combahee River to torch some strategic plantations, Tubman had gotten intel from fugitive slaves about where the Confederates had placed explosives on the riverbanks. As a result, the gunboats completed the raid unscathed, and Tubman led the escape of 750 South Carolina black men and women to freedom in that one raid. Wow. It's so fitting that in 1974, the Combahee Collective, another grounding black feminist organization, was named after that moment in history. Organized by Barbara Smith, among others, the collective provided a blueprint for espousing the need for self-love, the intersection of racism, classism, sexism, the role and recognition of lesbians of colors, who you can imagine how marginalized in the 1970s they were, who also analyzed predatory capitalism, we don't do that much of that anymore, and who addressed historic exclusions and racism in the predominantly white feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. Charlene de Blasio, I love making all these connections. Charlene de Blasio, the wife of the mayor of New York, I'm happy to inform you, was a member of that Combahee Collective. I just met her at an award ceremony for Barbara Smith. Another attendee back in 1896 at that 96 meeting was Ida B. Wells Barnett, of course, I couldn't leave without talking about her, who came to Washington with her 4-month-old child, Charles, to share in the historical moment of that great meeting in 1896. At the end of the meeting, Harriet Tubman came to the podium with little Charles, who was deemed the baby of the Federation, raised him over her head, and proclaimed him the baby of the Federation. Can you imagine that scene? Wow. It was Wells Barnett's anti-lynching campaign, especially after its triumph in the British Isles, that was a catalyst for the founding of the NACW, and the issue of racial violence and sexual exploitation subsequently became central to the activist agenda of subsequent organizations such as the NAACP, which, despite efforts to exclude her, that's another story you can ask about, she was a co-founder of. Both Wells Barnett's campaign and the NAACP called for a new abolitionist movement, referring to the coalition, the historic coalition of men and women, blacks and whites, who, despite what the movie Lincoln seems to tell us, really were responsible for the passage of the 13th Amendment, that prohibited slavery, but which afterwards fell apart, this coalition, after the 14th and 15th Amendments, the latter of which enfranchised black men and not women. Wells Barnett, who had the grit and determination subsequently seen in Fannie Lou Hamer, who, like Rosa Parks, was an anti-rape activist. We don't talk about Parks in those terms very much. Who had the political vision of an Ella Baker, and who tried, as Shirley Chisholm did, to reconstitute an interracial and feminist movement alliance, brought all this to bear on Chicago politics, where she founded the first black women's suffrage club in the city, the Alpha Suffrage Club, in 1913. In fact, it was the efforts of the Alpha Suffrage Club that was responsible for the election of Chicago's first black alderman in 1915, Oscar DePriest. By the 1920s, Chicago became a model of black women's political activism, with the most and the biggest black women's suffrage organizations in the country. Wells Barnett herself ran unsuccessfully as the first black woman to seek a Illinois State Senate seat in 1913. She was unsuccessful, but her legacy of black women's political participation was a rich one that made it no coincidence that the only black woman U.S. senator and the first African-American president had political roots in Chicago. It is only fitting that President Obama and the First Lady chose, among other venues, the 19th Street Baptist Church, home of the founding of the NACW, to worship and pray for change.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.